At 50 years old, this was John's life. Fired, blacklisted, invisible. The rain was pouring, plastering his thinning hair to his forehead. He clutched a warm pizza box, its flimsy logo doing nothing to shield it from the downpour. Every drop that soaked into his worn-out jacket felt like another reminder of his failure. He really thought his story was over, that the final chapters were just going to be a slow, quiet fade into nothing. What he didn't know was that his next delivery wasn't just an order. It was a meeting with his $823 million destiny. Where are you watching from and what do you do? Tell me in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe, because what's coming next will blow your mind. His name was John Kensington, and it wasn't that long ago that his hands were dusted with graphite from architectural pencils, not stained with pizza grease. For 25 years, John wasn't just an architect. He was a creator of skylines. His designs weren't just buildings. They were landmarks that told the story of the city. He'd poured his soul into the firm, working late nights, mentoring younger designers, and believing that loyalty was the foundation of a real career. He couldn't have been more wrong. His 50th birthday came and went, not with a party, but with a cold meeting invitation from the new VP of Operations, a man half his age with a smile that never quite reached his eyes. In that glass-walled conference room, John's world fell apart. He was told he was no longer a good fit, a sterile corporate phrase to sanitize the brutal truth he was being thrown away. The VP talked about restructuring and new energy, but John knew exactly what it meant. He was expensive, a piece of the old guard in an industry that now worshipped youth over experience. The betrayal left him feeling completely devalued, filled with a grief he couldn't even explain. He left the office that day with a cardboard box of his personal things, the echo of a quarter-century of dedication being erased in just 15 minutes. A security guard escorted him out of the building, a final cold humiliation that made it painfully clear his work, family, was just a machine. He thought finding another job would be easy. After all, he had the portfolio, the experience, and the reputation. But the industry was smaller than he thought. The VP who fired him had quietly poisoned the well, painting him as difficult and out of touch. It was a subtle professional blacklisting. Every interview ended the same way, a polite no. Soon, recruiters stopped returning his calls. His professional network just faded away. He had become a ghost in the very industry he'd helped build. The financial pressure mounted with terrifying speed. His savings evaporated. Mortgage payments loomed. The confident man who once commanded boardrooms was now staring at foreclosure notices, his self-worth crumbling with every past due bill. Like so many older workers pushed out of their careers, he felt a deep sense of betrayal by the company he'd given his life to. His days turned into a blur of anxiety and hopelessness. He finally landed a job at Luigi's Pizzeria. It was the only place that didn't ask for a resume. The owner had one rule: show up, work hard, get paid. The beat-up Honda Civic he used for deliveries was a constant, humiliating reminder of the luxury sedan he'd been forced to sell. Delivering pizzas at 50 was an exercise in swallowing your pride. He delivered to gleaming office buildings he'd once pitched designs for. He handed pizzas to former colleagues who either didn't recognize him or pretended they didn't. He put up with condescending tips from people his age and teenagers who snickered at the old guy bringing them a late-night snack. He was living what so many older workers face, a dramatic drop in earnings after being forced out of a career. The world he knew, a world of respect and accomplishment, was gone. In its place was the smell of pepperoni and the crushing weight of being a nobody. He was sure this was how his story would end. The call came on a Tuesday night during a torrential downpour. The address was on the other side of town, in a neighborhood of old money, with sprawling estates hidden behind stone walls. As John's rattling Civic pulled up the winding driveway, a colossal Gothic mansion appeared out of the gloom. It looked like something straight out of a classic novel. He grabbed the 2 large pizzas, ran to the massive oak door, and rang the bell, shivering more from a strange sense of dread than the cold. After a long moment, the heavy door creaked open. A man stood there, silhouetted in the warm light of the foyer. He was elderly, impeccably dressed in a tweed jacket, with sharp, intelligent eyes that seemed to look right through him. "That'll be $42.50, John mumbled. Holding out the order, the old man didn't even look at the pizzas. He just stared at John's face, his expression shifting from curiosity to pure shock. His gaze was so intense that John took a step back. "Good heavens," the man whispered, his voice raspy. "It can't be." He took a pair of spectacles from his pocket and put them on, peering at John as if he were a long-lost work of art. "Kensington," he said, reading the name stitched on the uniform. "Is your name John Kensington?" John just nodded, confused. "Yeah, look, sir, I have other deliveries." "My name is Alistair Finch," the man said, his voice trembling a little. "I was your great-uncle's attorney." "I've been searching for you for over a decade," John froze. Great-uncle? He didn't have a great-uncle, or at least he didn't think so. His father had been an orphan and never, ever spoke of his family. This had to be a mistake. Or worse, some kind of sick joke. "You've got the wrong person," John said, turning to leave. "Please," Mr. Finch pleaded, his voice suddenly urgent. "Your father was Thomas Kensington, wasn't he? And his brother?" His estranged brother? Was Arthur. The name sent a jolt through him. Arthur. John had a fuzzy childhood memory of his father saying that name once, in a hushed, sad voice, before quickly changing the subject. "Come inside," Mr. Finch insisted, gesturing toward the rain. "Just for a moment. I've spent the better part of my life managing a promise I made, and I believe you're the final piece of the puzzle. What I have to tell you could change your life." John hesitated. Every instinct screamed at him to get back to the familiar misery of his car, but there was something in the old man's eyes, an impossible hope that held him there. Against his better judgment, he stepped out of the rain and into the house. The door closed behind him with a heavy, final thud. He had no idea he'd just walked into a completely different life. The foyer was like a time capsule, full of dusty furniture covered in white sheets and portraits with eyes that seemed to follow him. Mr. Finch led him into a grand library lined with thousands of books. He cleared a stack of yellowed legal pads from a leather armchair and motioned for John to sit. "Your great-uncle, Arthur Kensington, was a genius," Finch began, his voice full of reverence. "A pioneer in fields that didn't even have names yet. Semiconductor technology, data encryption. The man was a true visionary. Back in the 70s and 80s, he filed patents for foundational technologies, the very logic that underpins almost every computer, every smartphone, every secure transaction on the internet today. A piece of it can be traced back to Arthur's work." John just stared at him, completely bewildered. This felt like a fairy tale, a story that had nothing to do with his reality of delivering pizzas for a living. Arthur was a recluse, Finch went on, pacing the room. "He and your father had a terrible falling out, a deep and bitter one, and he cut himself off from the entire world. He never married, had no children. He just lived in this house and worked. He licensed his patents through a web of shell corporations and amassed a fortune so vast that not even he truly understood its scale. When he passed away 30 years ago, he left a very simple will. Everything was to go to his brother's line, to the last surviving Kensington." "That's you, John." John shook his head and let out a bitter laugh. "Me? I have nothing. If this fortune is real, why am I just hearing about it now?" "Because finding you was a complete nightmare," Finch explained, his face grim. "Arthur's will was contested. Greedy, distant relatives came out of the woodwork, people he didn't even know existed. They forged documents, hired crooked lawyers, and dragged the estate through decades of legal hell. They tried to claim your father's line had ended, that you didn't exist. My job, as the executor of the will, was to protect Arthur's true wish, to fight off the vultures and find his rightful heir. For years, Finch battled them in court while quietly searching for Thomas Kensington's son. He hit one dead end after another until a recent breakthrough in digital records finally pointed him to a John Kensington living in this city. He'd been watching the house for a week, hoping to catch him, never imagining he'd show up on his own doorstep in a pizza uniform. "This is insane," John said, standing up. "This has to be a scam, is it?" Finch walked to a heavy wooden desk and unlocked a drawer. He pulled out a faded black and white photograph of two young men who looked almost identical. One was smiling broadly. The other stared at the camera with a serious, unnerving intensity. "That's your father, Thomas, on the left," Finch said softly. "And that is Arthur." John stared at the photo. He saw his own jawline, his own eyes, staring back at him from the past. He felt a dizzying wave of vertigo, as if the floor had just dropped out from under him. Finch then produced a copy of a birth certificate for a Thomas Kensington, which listed his brother, Arthur. The evidence was right there. It was real. This impossible, unbelievable story was actually real. "The final court case was settled last month," Finch said, his voice now firm and clear. "The challengers have exhausted all their appeals. The estate is, at long last, clear. And it belongs to you." A week later, John sat in another glass-walled room, not the one where his career was destroyed, but the opulent boardroom of a top law firm. Mr. Finch sat beside him, looking calm. Across the polished table sat Patricia Norwood, a woman whose sharp suit and sharper gaze commanded total authority. She slid a thick, leather-bound portfolio across the table. "Mr. Kensington," she began, her voice crisp, "we have completed the final accounting of the estate of Arthur Kensington. After liquidating assets, settling all taxes and fees, and consolidating holdings from 3 continents, we have the final number." John's heart was pounding so hard he could feel it in his throat. It felt like he was watching a scene from a movie. All his life he had been defined by loss, his career, his pride, his home. He braced himself, expecting a few $100,000 at best. Enough to pay off his debts, maybe start over in some small way. Ms. Norwood opened the portfolio to the final page and turned it to face him. At the bottom of a long list of figures was a single, highlighted number. $823,000. John just stared at it. The number was so huge, so astronomical, it didn't even seem real. Just digits on a page. He looked at Finch, who gave him a small, reassuring nod. He looked back at the number, $823 million. A sound escaped his throat, a choked sob that was half laughter and half grief. The tears he'd held back for years, tears of anger, humiliation, and despair, finally came flooding out. He wasn't crying for the money. He was crying for the man who had to deliver pizzas in the rain, for the architect who was made to believe his life's work meant nothing, for the 50-year-old who thought his story was over. In that instant, the crushing weight of his failure simply evaporated. He was no longer invisible. John's new life was never about the money. He didn't buy a yacht or a private jet. His very first act was to buy the apartment building where he lived, not to evict anyone, but to immediately lower the rent for all the tenants and pay for complete renovations. His second act was more personal. He walked into the gleaming lobby of his old architecture firm, wearing a perfectly tailored suit instead of a pizza uniform. He didn't ask to see the VP who had fired him. He just asked the receptionist to deliver a message. The message was a certified check for $10 million, an anonymous donation to the firm's pension fund, which he knew had been underfunded for years. On the memo line, he simply wrote, "Value is not always visible." But his true calling came when he established the Kensington Second Chance Foundation. Its mission was simple: to provide funding, retraining, and startup capital for professionals over 50 who had been pushed out of their industries. It was his answer to the systemic ageism that nearly broke him, a problem that affects countless experienced workers. The foundation became a beacon of hope for thousands who, like him, had been told they were no longer a good fit. Today, John Kensington spends his time in a light-filled studio overlooking the ocean. He's an architect again, sketching designs for community centres, affordable housing, and vocational schools. This time, however, he's building more than just buildings. He's building hope. His story is a powerful reminder that a person's worth is never defined by a job title or a bank account. Sometimes hitting rock bottom isn't an ending. It's just the foundation you needed to build a new life, one that is truly of your own design. Stories like John's remind us that it's never too late for a second act. If this story inspired you, please subscribe and hit the notification bell for more content that celebrates resilience and the human spirit. And be sure to share this video with someone who might need to hear that their best chapters may still be unwritten.